In the mist-shrouded mansion in Brookline, Elizabeth began her morning routine. The old wooden floors creaked as she first headed to the children's rooms. Emma, now in her teenage years, had learned to wake up on her own, but she still seemed to wait for her mother's "good morning," stirring at the sound of the knock on her door. Michael, on the other hand, still needed his mother's help. "Michael, time to wake up." In the room bathed in soft light, Elizabeth gently touched her son's cheek. Michael let out a small groan as he slowly opened his eyes. The maid, Martha, had already prepared breakfast. The table was set with warm croissants, scrambled eggs, and fresh fruit, while the aroma of coffee wafted through the room. James, her husband, was reading the morning paper as usual, occasionally smiling at Elizabeth and the children. "Dad, will you come to my piano recital after school today?" Emma asked hopefully. "I'm sorry, honey. I have an important meeting with a client today. But Mom will record it, and I'll definitely watch it tonight." Though Emma looked a bit disappointed at James's response, she quickly turned to her mother with a bright smile and said, "Then please make sure to record it, okay?" This peaceful daily life began to crumble with one phone call. The call from her family home brought news of Elizabeth's father William's passing. It had been a sudden heart attack. The funeral was conducted solemnly, yet with a warmth that reflected her father's character. The large number of attendees testified to his reputation not only as a pharmaceutical company executive but also as a philanthropist. Elizabeth shared memories with the attendees about visiting orphanages with her father when she was young. He had always said, "Wealth exists to be returned to society." However, after the funeral, the atmosphere around her began to change subtly. When the topic of inheritance arose, her husband's attitude shifted. Though he became even more attentive than before, there was something calculating lurking beneath. What concerned Elizabeth most was the sudden change in her mother-in-law Martha's behavior. Martha, who had previously visited only a few times a year, now started showing up 2 or 3 times a week. While she claimed it was out of concern, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that there was some other motive. She was particularly troubled by how persistently her mother-in-law brought up financial matters. Then, just before Thanksgiving, Martha called with an invitation. "Elizabeth, please celebrate Thanksgiving at our house this year. This is what families do, isn't it?" Despite the gentle tone of voice, an ominous feeling crept into Elizabeth's heart. Still, her own voice sounded surprisingly calm as she replied, "Thank you. I appreciate the invitation." That night, after putting the children to bed, Elizabeth gazed at the full moon from the study window, remembering her last conversation with her father. "Elizabeth, you have the strength to always make the right decisions. I believe in that." Those words now resonated with her like a warning. At dusk on Thanksgiving, Elizabeth paused momentarily before her mother-in-law's front door. The Georgian-style mansion, built in the 1920s, exuded its usual imposing presence. The red brick walls, illuminated by the golden sunset, seemed to be issuing a warning. Today especially, the chrysanthemums in the usually well-tended front garden appeared to cast ominous shadows. "Mom, let's go in." Michael tugged at her sleeve. Beside him, Emma, though wearing the typical difficult expression of adolescence, occasionally glanced at her mother with concern. Elizabeth took a deep breath and reached for the heavy wooden door. When the door opened, Martha greeted them with a broad smile. She was dressed in a full-length Chanel dress with a Cartier necklace gleaming at her throat. Beside her stood James, wearing an Hermès tie and smiling with unusual formality. "Elizabeth, I'm so glad you came." And the children, and James. Her voice showed none of its usual haughtiness. Rather, it was unnaturally friendly. Martha's perfume seemed stronger than usual. Entering the great hall, several guests had already arrived. Elizabeth's attention was drawn to a tall, middle-aged man. Dressed in a gray Brooks Brothers suit with piercing eyes, he was introduced as Attorney Richard Stern. His presence seemed oddly out of place. "I've heard so much about you, Mrs. Walker." Stern's handshake was slightly too long and too firm. Elizabeth shivered at the coldness transmitted through his palm. After brief socializing in the reception room, the party moved to the dining room. Along the way, Elizabeth felt as if the eyes in the portraits lining the hallway were following her. Portraits of 18th-century New England aristocrats seemed to stand as witnesses to tonight's events. The dining table was appropriately lavish for Thanksgiving. The turkey was perfectly roasted, and the vibrant red of the cranberry sauce stimulated the appetite. The sweet potato casserole wafted cinnamon aromas, while the pecan pie had baked to a golden brown, its rich fragrance filling the room. White roses in a Tiffany vase at the center of the table highlighted the elegance of the setting. The crystal chandelier cast graceful light on the silver cutlery. "Elizabeth, try this wine," Martha called out. "I chose it especially for you. It's an Opus 1 2015. The deep ruby liquid was poured into a baccarat crystal glass. Elizabeth accepted it politely. At that moment, the reflected light briefly cast an eerie gleam in Martha's eyes. "Thank you, Mother." As she tilted the glass, rich aromas tickled her nostrils. Notes of cassis and blackberry mingled with subtle hints of vanilla. The first sip was indeed excellent. But immediately after, the strange sensations began. First, a slight numbness in her fingertips. Then, a sudden feeling of heat as if the room's temperature had risen dramatically. Her vision began to blur gradually. The chandelier's light appeared distorted, like a kaleidoscope. Elizabeth tried hurriedly to set down her glass, but her hands wouldn't obey her commands. "Elizabeth, are you all right?" Her husband's voice seemed to come from far away. As she tried to stand, her legs gave way and she stumbled. The expensive Chinese vase on the table appeared to blur and double before her eyes. "Oh my, are you feeling unwell?" Her mother-in-law's voice contained clearly artificial concern. In the periphery of her vision, she vaguely saw Attorney Stern pulling some documents from his leather briefcase. She could hear the children's voices. "Mom." However, Emma and Michael were quickly led to another room. "It's all right, your mother's just tired. Let's watch the Thanksgiving special," she heard her mother-in-law say, as if echoing from a distant cave. Just before losing consciousness, Elizabeth heard fragments of multiple conversations. The voices echoed and sometimes overlapped, seeping into her clouding consciousness. "How's the drug working?" "Just as planned. She'll be completely unconscious in a few minutes." "Are the documents ready?" "Everything's prepared. Including the inheritance renunciation papers." "Quickly, while she's unconscious, get her signature." "Just move her finger. I'll guide her hand." The last thing she heard was her mother-in-law's cold laugh. Then complete darkness fell. The candle flame on the table extinguished along with Elizabeth's consciousness. When consciousness began to return, the first thing she noticed was the smell of antiseptic. As her hearing returned, she could make out the regular beeping of an EKG monitor. The sound of dripping from an 4 marked time like a clock's second hand. Elizabeth slowly opened her eyes. A white ceiling. An unfamiliar hospital room. The characteristic sterile atmosphere of Brigham and Women's Hospital. Outside the window, night had already fallen. Not a single star was visible in Boston's November sky. "Ah, you're awake." Standing beside the bed was her husband James. The same gentle smile as always. But his eyes weren't smiling. In those pupils lurked a cold light that Elizabeth had never seen before. And beside him stood a familiar figure, Attorney Stern, holding what appeared to be an expensive fountain pen. On the hospital room table lay a document. It was a consent form for renouncing inheritance rights. Elizabeth's signature was already there. Her familiar signature. But it was clearly written while she was unconscious. "My signature." When she asked in a hoarse voice, her husband coldly replied, "Yes, the signature is done. You signed it yourself. We have witnesses." The calculating tone in those words no longer attempted to hide itself. At that moment, Elizabeth's last conversation with her father flashed through her mind. Along with the warmth of his hand holding hers on his deathbed, his words came back with crystal clarity. "Elizabeth, you have the strength to always make the right decisions. I believe in that." Yes, this was the beginning of a battle. Elizabeth quietly closed her eyes, steeling herself for the long struggle ahead. For the sake of her children, and to protect her father's legacy, she had to face this injustice. In her heart, a flame of anger began to burn quietly but surely. Elizabeth's steps were still a bit unsteady as she walked down the hospital corridor. 24 hours had passed since the previous night's events, and she had finally received permission from her doctor to leave her room. A nurse in white walked casually beside her. "Mrs. Walker, are you really all right?" The nurse wearing a name tag reading Christine Chen spoke with concern. She had been Elizabeth's assigned nurse since the emergency admission the night before. "Yes, I'm fine. But..." Elizabeth chose her words carefully before continuing. "I'd like to ask you about last night." The two entered the cafeteria facing the hospital's courtyard. Through the large windows, they could see maple trees in their autumn colors. The late November Boston sky was heavily overcast. "Could you tell me in detail about when I was brought in last night?" Christine glanced around once before speaking. "To be honest, something has been bothering me. During the emergency admission, your husband said it was an attack from a chronic condition. But there's no such record in your medical history." She lowered her voice further and continued. "And there's something concerning in the blood test results." At that moment, their conversation was interrupted by a shrill voice. "Elizabeth. So this is where you were." Turning around, there stood Martha in a flashy Chanel suit. Next to her was someone who appeared to be a hospital administrator. "Dr. Harrison, could you please expedite this patient's discharge procedures? We have family matters to discuss." Martha's voice had returned to its usual commanding tone. However, something had changed within Elizabeth during these 24 hours. "Mother, I'm staying here. And," she put force into her voice, "this might be a matter for the police." Martha's expression froze for a moment. But she quickly recovered, forcing a smile. "My dear, what are you saying? Last night was just an allergic reaction. You simply reacted to the sulfites in the wine." At that moment, a woman appeared at the cafeteria entrance. In her mid-50s, with a dignified bearing, she walked straight toward Elizabeth. "Mrs. Walker, I'm Sarah Cohen." She extended her business card. I received a call from Judith Green, a board member of the Harvard Law School Alumni Association. Actually, I'd like to discuss your case. Martha tried to interrupt, but Sarah didn't back down an inch. Mrs. Martha Walker, I'd like to speak with you about this matter as well. Particularly, she fixed her with a sharp gaze, about your relationship with Attorney Stern. In the laboratory at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Elizabeth stared at the detailed blood test results. Dr. Emily Rodriguez was explaining the technical terms in layman's terms. The drug detected in your blood is a type of benzodiazepine. Specifically, she lowered her voice, it's a component known as a date rape drug. Sarah Cohen quickly took notes. The dosage? More than double the normal amount. Enough to completely render someone unconscious. In the hallway, Detective Mike Donovan was taking testimony from Nurse Christine. Fragments of conversation reached Elizabeth's ears. About the circumstances during the emergency admission. Yes. Her husband was unnaturally calm. As if he had been expecting it. Sarah pulled out new documents. Elizabeth, there are also concerning points about your father, William Carter's death certificate. Though it's listed as a heart attack, actually. At that moment, the hospital room door burst open, and Emma and Michael rushed in. They were brought by Rachel Morrison, Elizabeth's childhood friend and the children's teacher. Mom! Michael clung to Elizabeth, crying. Emma stood at a slight distance, but her eyes were filled with worry. Bringing the children was my decision, Rachel explained. Emma overheard some strange conversations. Emma began speaking in a trembling voice. Yesterday, while watching TV in the other room, I heard Grandma talking to someone. They said, all the assets will be ours. Sarah carefully noted this testimony as well. Emma, you're very brave. Would you be willing to testify in court? Emma looked at her mother. Elizabeth quietly nodded. In a conference room on the top floor of Brigham and Women's Hospital, with a panoramic view of Boston, Sarah Cohen, Dr. Rodriguez, Detective Donovan, and Elizabeth sat around the table. Let's organize the evidence we have, Sarah began. First, the blood test results. Dr. Rodriguez spread out the documents. Dangerous levels of drugs were detected. This was clearly intentional administration. Next, the hospital staff testimony. Detective Donovan continued, pulling out new documents. The unnatural behavior during transport, and, he produced another document, records showing Attorney Stern told reception he had an appointment before entering the hospital. Sarah frowned. So this was all planned. And about my father's death, Elizabeth's voice trembled. Yes, Sarah chose her words carefully. Regarding William Carter's cause of death, we need a reinvestigation. Though it's listed as a sudden heart attack, there's evidence suggesting the same drug might have been used. At that moment, Elizabeth's cell phone rang. The display showed unknown. A hushed male voice spoke. Mrs. Walker, I used to work at Attorney Stern's office. I have important evidence. Records of dealings with your mother-in-law. That night, Elizabeth had left the children with the family maid, Martha Johnson. Having served the Carter family for 42 years, she was like a second mother to Elizabeth. Your father might have foreseen that a day like this would come. Martha Johnson took out an envelope from an old safe. Just before your father passed away, he entrusted this to me, saying, when Elizabeth needs it. The envelope contained a USB drive and handwritten notes. In William's meticulous handwriting were details of certain transactions. Evidence of a property embezzlement scheme planned over 5 years by Martha Walker and attorney Stern. And this was her father's final gift to thwart it. Elizabeth quietly but firmly steeled herself for the legal battle ahead. The Norfolk County Courthouse was washed by cold December rain. As Elizabeth climbed the imposing stone steps with Sarah Cohen, she reflected on the past 3 weeks. The USB drive left by her father contained 5 years' worth of email backups between Martha Walker and attorney Stern. There were traces of a long-term plan targeting William Carter's assets. Until the very end, her father had tried to protect his daughter. Just before the courtroom doors opened, Elizabeth turned to look at Emma and Michael sitting in the back rows. The faithful maid Martha Johnson sat beside them. Emma gave her mother a small nod. There was no more hesitation in her eyes. The clerk's voice rang out, and Judge Margaret O'Connell entered. She was a veteran who had presided over Massachusetts family law cases for over 30 years. We begin the hearing in the case of Elizabeth Carter Walker versus James Walker and Martha Walker. The first witness called was Dr. Emily Rodriguez. She began detailed testimony about the blood test results. The drug detected in the victim's blood was flunitrazepam. It's known as a date rape drug, and the dosage was 2.5 times the normal amount. This was clearly an amount intended to render someone completely unconscious. Attorney Stern stood for cross-examination. Can these symptoms be distinguished from a simple allergic reaction to wine? Yes, Dr. Rodriguez answered firmly. One look at the histamine levels in the blood makes it clear. This was not an allergic reaction. The next witness was Nurse Christine Chen. She gave a detailed account of the circumstances during the emergency admission that night. What particularly struck me was Mr. Walker's attitude. Normally, when family members are brought in for emergency care, they're in a panic. However, Mr. Walker was unnaturally calm, explaining, "It's an attack from my wife's chronic condition," as if reading from a script. Attorney Stern stood up again. Wasn't he simply trying to maintain composure as a husband? No, Christine answered with conviction. I've worked in the emergency room for 15 years. His behavior was clearly unnatural. After the lunch recess, Thomas Reynolds, Attorney Stern's former secretary, took the witness stand. With trembling hands, he produced a document. This is a contract between Mrs. Martha Walker and Mr. Stern. It promises a payment of $500,000, plus an additional 10% of the Carter family assets as a success fee. As the courtroom erupted in commotion, Attorney Stern's expression cracked for the first time. Next, Sarah Cohen submitted new evidence regarding William's death. I submit to the court the results of a re-examination of William Carter's tissue samples. The substance detected was the same drug that was administered to Elizabeth Walker. At this testimony, Martha Walker suddenly stood up. However, beside her, James maintained his hard expression. Finally, Emma was called as the last witness. The 13-year-old girl took the stand with a nervous expression. Emma, Sarah spoke gently. Could you tell us about the conversation you heard on Thanksgiving night? Emma took a deep breath and slowly began speaking. Michael and I were watching TV in another room. But I needed to use the bathroom, so I went into the hallway. That's when I heard Grandma talking to someone on the phone. What specifically did you hear? Grandma was saying, everything is going according to plan. The drug should work for sure. All the assets will be ours. Emma continued, fighting back tears. And she also said, we'll eliminate anyone who gets in our way. During this testimony, the color drained from Martha's face. Meanwhile, James suddenly stood up. "Your Honor," his voice echoed through the courtroom. "I have a statement to make." Judge O'Connell raised her chin. "Go ahead." "I confess to all charges." And, he took a deep breath, "I wish to testify about the full extent of the plan orchestrated by my mother, Martha Walker, and attorney Richard Stern." As the courtroom erupted again, Martha cried out. "James! What are you saying?" "Mother, enough." James's voice was tired. "I can't tell any more lies in front of my children." Judge O'Connell fixed James with a sharp gaze. "You understand your testimony will be treated as that of an accomplice?" "Yes, I'm prepared for that." In his subsequent testimony, James revealed everything. His enormous debts, Martha's scheme, and even the truth about William Carter's death. Elizabeth listened quietly to her husband's testimony. 13 years of marriage. 2 children. Had it all been used merely for her mother-in-law's ambitions? The rain had stopped, and winter sunlight streamed through the courtroom windows. Judge O'Connell delivered the final verdict. This court sentences defendant Martha Walker to 15 years imprisonment for attempted murder, attempted fraud, and document forgery. Defendant James Walker is sentenced to 4 years imprisonment, taking into account his voluntary testimony. Defendant Richard Stern is sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for conspiracy and permanent disbarment. After the verdict was delivered, Elizabeth went to her children. Emma and Michael rushed into their mother's arms. "Mom, is it over now?" Michael asked anxiously. "Yes, it's over." Elizabeth held her children tightly. "Now we'll start a new life." Outside the window, a dove took flight toward the sky, as if celebrating the triumph of justice. As they left the courthouse, Sarah Cohen approached Elizabeth. "There's one thing that's been on my mind," she lowered her voice. "Your father might have foreseen all of this. There's still an unopened folder on the USB drive. It's titled, 'For Elizabeth's New Life.'" Elizabeth quietly nodded. 3 months after the verdict, she had begun a new life with her children. The mansion overlooking the Charles River was a gift her father had secretly purchased, recorded in the folder titled, "For Elizabeth's New Life." "Mom, look at the tulips blooming in the garden." At Michael's voice, Elizabeth stood by the window. Colorful tulips swayed in the spring breeze. She remembered words her father had once spoken. "Flowers always bloom in spring, no matter how harsh the winter. Life is the same way." There was a knock at the study door, and Emma peeked in. "Mom, the media people are requesting interviews again." The case had shocked the entire nation. Headlines like "Family Feud Shakes Boston High Society" and "Inheritance Poisoning Plot" had dominated the news. However, what was most important to Elizabeth was that the case had prompted others who had suffered similar abuse to speak up. "We'll decline all interviews," Elizabeth answered quietly. "Except for the support organizations." She had continued her father's legacy by establishing the Carter Family Protection Fund, an organization supporting people struggling with family financial troubles and inheritance disputes. That afternoon, Sarah Cohen visited. She had become not just Elizabeth's lawyer, but a close friend. "We've received reports from the prison." Sarah shared updates about the 3 convicts. Martha Walker was serving her 15-year sentence. The former social butterfly now spent her days alone in a cell. With no visitors, her arrogance had completely crumbled. James was participating in rehabilitation programs as a model prisoner. His letters to the children always contained words of remorse. Elizabeth was still undecided about whether to give these letters to the children. Attorney Stern had been ordered to pay massive compensation in addition to his 2-year sentence. Permanently disbarred, he had been completely expelled from the legal community. Elizabeth, Sarah carefully began. James has requested to meet with the children. Elizabeth gazed out the window before slowly answering. I'll respect the children's wishes. Both Emma and Michael are old enough to decide for themselves. Indeed, the children had grown remarkably strong. Emma had landed the lead role in the school play, and Michael had been chosen as captain of the baseball team. The wounds were steadily healing. In the evening, Rachel Morrison came to pick up the children. She continued to provide unwavering support. Elizabeth, I'm thinking of taking the children horseback riding this weekend. How about we all have a picnic? That's a wonderful suggestion, Elizabeth smiled. That night, after putting the children to bed, Elizabeth opened the final folder her father had left. It contained a letter and detailed business plans. To my beloved daughter. By the time you read this letter, you will have already overcome great trials. The wealth I left behind is not a curse. It is a tool to help more people. I have always believed in your strength. And now, it's time to use that strength for society. The enclosed business plan is a dream I've nurtured for years, a plan to transform the pharmaceutical company into a more people-oriented enterprise. You are the only one who can make this dream a reality. With love. Father. Elizabeth quietly wiped away her tears. The full moon visible from the study window shone as gently as the moon her father had seen in his final moments. The next morning, she woke early. The morning sun reflected off the Charles River, heralding the start of a new day. She woke the children and began preparing breakfast as usual. Mom, can I invite friends over after school today? Emma asked. Of course. Daily life was steadily returning. But it wasn't the same daily life as before. It was a new daily life, bound by stronger, deeper family ties. The newspaper at the entrance carried an article, Carter Family Protection Fund implements 100 support case. Elizabeth was surely carrying on her father's will and returning her own experiences to society.